Welcome to Nothing is Rushing. Tonight, we are stepping into a medieval wedding, and it was far more intense than most people imagine. Behind the candles, the veils, and the church bells, there was a world of family pressure, sacred vows, strange customs, public judgment, and a marriage that could shape an entire future. This is the real story of what a medieval wedding was actually like. Before we begin, just a small reminder. If you would like to find this place again, subscribing and leaving a small like is enough. But if you do nothing right now, that is perfectly fine too. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing listeners joining from all around the world. Now settle in, lower the lights, and let us slowly drift into tonight's journey. If we want to understand what a medieval wedding was really like, the first thing we must do is set aside the modern idea that marriage began mainly as a private celebration of love, because in much of medieval Europe, it stood at the centre of social life in a far more practical and public way. Affection could exist, attraction could matter, and tenderness was certainly not absent. Yet marriage itself was rarely treated as a decision belonging only to two hearts. It was tied to household survival, family reputation, labour, land, inheritance, religious order, and the future stability of the community. A wedding, then, was not simply the beautiful ending of a romance. It was also the formal beginning of an arrangement that many other people cared deeply about, which is a polite way of saying that medieval relatives were unlikely to stay quietly in the background. That does not mean medieval people were cold or incapable of feeling. Real life is never that simple. People still admired one another, hoped, worried, blushed, and no doubt made a few unwise choices in the name of emotion, just as people do now. But the world around them did not allow love to stand alone so easily. Marriage joined not only a bride and groom, but also families, obligations, property, labour, and expectations stretching far into the future. Among peasants, it might mean the joining of work, tools, and household strength. Among nobles, it might shape alliances, inheritance, and political strategy. The scale changed, but the seriousness did not. The Church deepened that seriousness by giving marriage a sacred dimension beyond convenience or family advantage. By the High Middle Ages, marriage was increasingly treated as a holy bond, morally significant and publicly recognisable, something that required consent, ritual form, and communal witness. That gave weddings a striking double nature. They were practical and sacred at once, worldly and spiritual, intimate and public. A medieval couple did not step into marriage inside a private bubble of feeling. They stepped into a union that family, priest, neighbours, and the wider moral world all believed they had some right to see, bless, and judge. So before there were church doors, feast tables, garments, music, and ritual, there was this deeper truth. Medieval marriage mattered because it held many parts of life together at once. It could secure labour, protect property, satisfy religion, reassure kin, and give shape to the household that would follow. Love might well be present, but it entered as one important force among many, not as the only ruler of the event. To begin the story properly, then, is to begin there, with marriage not as a simple romantic conclusion, but as one of the main ways medieval society preserved itself and explained itself to the next generation. Before there was a wedding, there was usually a slower and much less polished stage in which a possible marriage began to take shape. And this stage did not always resemble the modern image of private romance unfolding in perfect freedom. Medieval courtship was shaped by place, class, custom, and supervision, which meant that even when affection grew naturally, it usually grew in a world where family, work, and reputation were never far away. People met in villages, at markets, during seasonal labour, around feast days, through kin, or within the orbit of the same household, and from these ordinary points of contact, a possible match might slowly emerge. Among ordinary people, courtship could be practical, local, and woven into daily life. A young man and woman might already know one another through the same parish, the same village paths, or the same rhythm of work, and so familiarity often came before formal intention. Among the wealthy, however, the process could be watched more carefully, with family interests weighing heavily on what was encouraged or discouraged. Even so, impressions still mattered. A person's reputation for steadiness, modesty, capability, fertility, or good sense could quietly shape how a match was judged, which suggests that medieval romance, though supervised, still left room for human curiosity and the occasional hopeful glance. This stage mattered because marriage was expected to last, function, and carry consequences beyond the wedding day itself. Courtship, therefore, was not simply a sweet prelude to vows, but a period in which people and families tried to judge whether a union made sense. Could the pair work together? Was the household respectable? Was there enough support, land, skill, or stability to make marriage more than a beautiful mistake? These questions did not always destroy tenderness. They simply stood beside it, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes wisely, and sometimes with the stubbornness of relatives who believed they had seen enough of life to be right about everything. That is what makes medieval courtship feel both distant and familiar. It was more public than many modern people would like, and far more tied to social consequences than our most romantic stories usually admit. Yet beneath all that structure, there were still two people moving toward uncertainty together. There was still hope, still nervousness, still curiosity, and quite likely the timeless human problem of trying to look dignified while being observed by half the village. Courtship, then, was not separate from marriage in the medieval world. It was the first careful testing of whether marriage could begin at all. If courtship allowed a possible match to begin taking shape, then family involvement was the moment when that possibility became serious in a more unmistakably medieval sense, because marriage rarely belonged to two individuals alone. A son or daughter might feel hope, hesitation, or personal preference, but once the matter reached the attention of parents, guardians, or senior kin, it entered a wider circle of judgment in which affection had to stand beside reputation, property, labour, alliances, and the future stability of both households. A marriage could not be treated as a small private adventure when it had the power to alter inheritance, household strength, and the balance of obligation between families. Among peasants and ordinary townspeople, this involvement was often practical rather than grand. Families wanted to know whether the proposed spouse could work, whether the household seemed steady, whether the union would create more security than strain, and whether the community would view it as respectable. Even where there was little land to negotiate, there was still much at stake. A marriage joined labour, shaped living arrangements, influenced childbearing, and affected who might care for ageing parents or inherit modest but meaningful household goods. In wealthier circles, the same concerns existed on a larger scale, with land, dowries, titles, and influence making the process far more strategic, though not necessarily any warmer. This does not mean families always behaved like cold merchants discussing a transaction, although some surely came close enough to make romance feel rather underfunded. More often, their involvement reflected a world in which marriage was expected to support life, not simply decorate it. Parents had learned through experience and hardship that affection could brighten a union, but grain, tools, kin support, and stable arrangements could make the difference between a workable household and a deeply unhappy one. Their interference, if we wish to call it that, was often rooted in necessity as much as control. This stage therefore introduces one of the most human tensions in the whole story, the point where desire meets structure. Families asked questions the couple might have preferred to avoid, yet those questions were rarely meaningless. They belonged to a society that understood survival in collective terms. A marriage was not simply between bride and groom. It was also between households, resources, expectations, and futures. Once families began to speak, the path toward the wedding became clearer, but it also became less private. What had started as a possibility between two people was slowly turning into a matter the whole world around them could see. Once families had begun to treat a possible match seriously, the relationship moved into a new stage, one that was less uncertain than courtship, but not yet the wedding itself. This was the world of promises, understandings, negotiations, and early commitments, the point at which a future marriage started to acquire real shape. In medieval Europe, this stage could vary widely by region, class, and local custom, but one truth remained fairly constant. Words mattered. A promise made publicly, or before the right witnesses, could carry far more weight than a modern listener might expect. Marriage did not always begin with a grand ceremony. Sometimes it began earlier, in spoken intent that slowly gathered social, legal, and moral force. This is where engagement, though not always called that in a neatly modern way, begins to emerge. A couple might be regarded as promised, families might exchange gifts, and preparations could begin long before the actual wedding day. Among ordinary people, such agreements could be simple, grounded in local memory and communal witness. Among the wealthy, they could become much more formal, involving written arrangements, property concerns, and deliberate family strategy. Either way, once a promise hardened into expectation, stepping away from it became far more difficult, because the union was no longer just imagined. It had begun to exist in public thought. The medieval world treated spoken commitments with unusual seriousness because trust, memory, and reputation were central to how society functioned. A broken promise could do more than wound feelings. It could embarrass families, disturb property plans, provoke conflict, and stain a name in the eyes of the community. That is why this stage was never merely a pretty pause before celebration. It was a threshold. The couple had not yet crossed fully into marriage, but they were no longer drifting through possibility either. The future had started leaning in their direction, and everyone around them could feel it. Even here, though, the human side of things did not disappear. There must still have been nervous anticipation, quiet doubts, awkward visits, and all the emotional weather that gathers when two lives are being drawn together by more than chance. A promised marriage brought clarity, but not complete peace. It answered one question while opening many others. The wedding day was now visible ahead, though still distant enough to gather tension around it. Before vows could be spoken in church, many practical matters still had to be settled, and among the most important were money, goods, land, and the whole material language through which medieval families tried to make marriage secure. If modern people sometimes imagine weddings as emotional turning points, surrounded by music, light, and private feeling, the medieval world would gently remind them that marriage also had weight, and much of that weight was material. Before a couple could step into married life, someone had to consider what they would live on, what would be brought into the union, what might be inherited later, and how the new household would stand in relation to land, tools, livestock, goods, and family expectation. This is where dowries, property arrangements, and practical negotiation entered the story, not as cold interruptions to love, but as part of the framework that made marriage workable in a society where security could be fragile and survival often depended on planning ahead. A dowry, in the broad medieval sense, was not simply a decorative custom or a rich family's flourish. It could be an essential transfer of resources meant to support the marriage and define the position of the bride within it. Depending on class and region, that might mean money, land, household goods, clothing, linens, livestock, utensils, or rights connected to property. Among the wealthy, these arrangements could become highly strategic, since marriage often moved estates, influence, and inheritance in ways that affected far more than the couple themselves. Among ordinary people, the scale was smaller, but the importance could be just as serious. A chest, a bed, a cow, a few tools, or a modest sum of coin might matter enormously if they helped the new household begin without sliding immediately into hardship. This practical side of marriage does not make the medieval wedding less human. If anything, it makes it more so, because it reminds us that people were trying to build lives, not merely perform ideals. A fine promise was not enough if there was no bed, no storage chest, no means of work, no secure right to property, or no understanding of what would happen if a husband died young or a harvest failed badly. Medieval people could be romantic in feeling, but they were rarely romantic about survival. They knew that a marriage feast might last a day, while the household it created would have to endure winter, debt, illness, quarrels, and all the slow practical demands of ordinary life. That is why property discussions should not be treated as lifeless bookkeeping. They were part of the emotional reality as well. A generous arrangement could bring relief. A weak one could produce anxiety before the wedding had even begun. Dowries, goods, and household provisions often revealed affection, tension, generosity, ambition, or mistrust, sometimes all at once. In the Middle Ages, marriage always stood at the meeting point between feeling and structure, and this was one of the clearest places where that truth became visible. The union had to mean something to the heart, yes, but it also had to stand firmly enough to bear the future. By the time a medieval marriage had passed through courtship, family judgment, promises, and practical arrangements, one question still remained quietly alive beneath everything else, and it is the question modern listeners almost always want to ask first. Where did love stand in all this? The answer is not that love was absent, nor that it ruled freely, but that it occupied a more uncertain and less commanding place than many people today would prefer. Medieval men and women were not strangers to affection, admiration, tenderness, or longing. Yet they lived in a world where such feelings were expected to fit themselves into a larger structure of duty, religion, kinship, and survival. Marriage was supposed to work, and if love entered it, so much the better. But love alone was rarely considered enough to justify the whole union. This does not make medieval people colder than us. It makes their conditions stricter. In a society where labour was constant, security fragile, and family continuity deeply important, a marriage could not easily be treated as a private emotional experiment. A husband was generally expected to provide, represent the household outwardly, and exercise authority within it, while a wife was expected to manage domestic life, contribute labour, bear children if possible, and help preserve order, reputation, and continuity. These expectations were not equal in power, and they were certainly not light. Men and women entered marriage under different burdens, and those burdens shaped what love could become. Affection might brighten the union, soften it, or grow slowly within it, but the structure arrived first. That is one reason medieval marriage could contain both warmth and strain without seeming contradictory. A union might begin with modest fondness and deepen over time through shared work and endurance. Another might settle into respect without tenderness. Another, no doubt, could become lonely or bitter. Medieval life had room for all these possibilities because it was not built on the assumption that emotion alone would carry two people safely through years of labour, childbirth, illness, harvest pressure, and family obligation. Marriage was expected to be more durable than feeling, and whether that was wisdom or severity depended very much on the people inside it. One suspects that some brides and grooms discovered this rather quickly, perhaps while sitting through earnest family advice that made romance feel like the least organised person in the room. So when we ask where love stood, the truest answer may be that it stood beside necessity rather than above it. It could make marriage gentler, more companionable, and more deeply human, but it was rarely allowed to define the whole union by itself. Medieval people seem to have understood, sometimes gently, and sometimes with rather stern realism, that a household needs more than passion to remain standing. By this point in the story, then, the marriage has been imagined, judged, promised, and prepared in practical terms. Yet one final transformation is still ahead. The day itself must now be chosen, and the household must begin turning expectation into ceremony. As the wedding moved from intention toward reality, attention turned to the day itself, and in medieval life, the choosing of that day was not simply a matter of convenience or whichever date seemed prettiest in memory. Time carried religious, seasonal, and practical meaning, which meant that a wedding had to find its place within a larger calendar that people took seriously. Certain periods of the church year were more suitable than others, while fasting seasons and prohibited times could narrow the choices. At the same time, marriage could not be carelessly placed in the middle of the busiest agricultural demands, because households still needed to sow, reap, tend animals, preserve food, and survive the ordinary strain of the year. A wedding interrupted routine, and so routine had to permit it. That gave the date itself a quiet importance. The church's rhythm and the rhythm of the land stood close beside one another, and a sensible family listened to both. A noble household could ignore practical inconvenience a little more easily than a poor one, but not entirely, because even wealthier weddings depended on servants, travel, food preparation, and favourable timing. Among ordinary people, the matter was even more direct. A badly chosen wedding day could mean overwork, poor attendance, strain on supplies, or an event overshadowed by the wrong season altogether. Medieval people did not choose a wedding date merely to mark a romantic anniversary before it had even happened. They chose it because life had to make room for marriage in a world where time was already crowded with necessity. Once the day was fixed, the household itself began to change in atmosphere. Preparations spread outward into rooms, yards, kitchens, and conversations. Food had to be planned, clothing made ready, guests expected, benches arranged, linens checked, and every small weakness of the household suddenly seemed far more visible than it had a week before. A family might tolerate disorder in ordinary months, but not when relatives, neighbours, or social superiors were about to arrive and quietly judge everything, from the bride's garment to the condition of the bread. Weddings have always had a talent for making familiar objects feel as though they too are being inspected for moral character. What is especially human about this stage is the mixture of anticipation and pressure it creates. The wedding is no longer an idea discussed in abstract terms. It has entered the house. People move with more purpose, speak with more certainty, and worry with more detail. Younger relatives drift underfoot at exactly the wrong moments. Older kin become unexpectedly authoritative, and ordinary tasks begin to glow with ceremonial importance. Long before the vows are spoken, the marriage is already changing the shape of daily life. The household is no longer waiting for the future, it is preparing to receive it. When modern people imagine a medieval wedding, they often picture something very close to a modern bridal fantasy, with a white gown, a singular dress worn only once, and a kind of timeless elegance that seems untouched by practicality. The medieval world, however, was much less devoted to that idea and much more concerned with clothing as a language of status, dignity, and public respectability. Wedding garments certainly mattered, but not always because they were unique in the modern sense. More often, they mattered because they presented the bride and groom as properly prepared for one of the most important public moments of their lives. A wedding was an occasion to look one's best, yet best usually meant appropriate, honourable, and as fine as one's means could credibly support. Fabrics, colours, trimming, and condition all carried meaning. Fine wool, linen, silk in wealthy settings, fur edging, embroidery, brooches, veils, belts, and carefully dyed cloth could signal rank before anyone spoke. A peasant bride would not resemble a noblewoman, but that did not make her appearance unimportant. Even modest households tried to present beauty through care, cleanliness, repair, and treasured garments reserved for major occasions. Among the wealthy, the scale widened dramatically. Rich colours, costly textiles, jewelled details, and formal layering could transform the wedding body into a visible statement of family standing. The clothing did not simply cover the person, it announced the household behind the person. This is one reason wedding dress holds such power in the historical imagination. It stands at the point where private hope becomes public image. A bride might wear cloth made or preserved with years of care, or garments enriched by family effort, inheritance, or gift. A groom's attire mattered as well, though history is often less sentimental about his sleeves. He too had to appear steady, respectable, and worthy of the role he was about to enter. In a world where people were closely observed, clothing offered reassurance that the marriage was being approached with seriousness. A well-dressed couple suggested that the household had prepared properly, and preparation itself was a moral as well as social virtue. Yet for all the beauty involved, wedding clothing was never only about elegance. It was about readability. Guests needed to look at the garments and understand the occasion, the rank, the effort, and the dignity being claimed. A wedding outfit had to fit the world around it. It had to say, without speaking, that this day mattered and that the family had done what it could to honour it. By the time the garments were ready and the fabric settled into place, the couple were no longer just names in conversation or promises in preparation. They were becoming visible figures in a ceremony that was drawing very near. The morning of a medieval wedding must often have felt unlike any other morning, even when the same fire had to be lit, the same floor crossed, and the same ordinary objects still stood where they had always stood, because the difference lay not in the room itself, but in the knowledge that by evening the household would no longer feel quite the same. A bride who had woken many times in the same bedchamber now rose with the awareness that she was moving toward a public change in name, status, duty, and expectation. A groom, whether calm by nature or simply performing calm with admirable determination, faced the equally sobering truth that he was about to stand before kin, neighbours, and priest as a man entering a recognised adult role. The day had begun, and there was no longer much space left for imagination to pretend that marriage was still safely far away. In such a morning, every familiar task became charged with unusual meaning. Water for washing was no longer only water. Clothing was no longer only clothing. Bread eaten quickly before the ceremony, if eaten at all, may have tasted strangely distant because the mind was already ahead of the body, standing at the church door before the feet had even reached it. One imagines rooms full of small movements and murmured instructions, older women adjusting garments, younger relatives hovering where they were least useful, and at least one person in every household speaking with total confidence about a missing ribbon, an absent belt, or a delayed loaf, as though civilization itself might fail before noon. Weddings have always had a gift for persuading sensible people that minor disorder is the first step toward catastrophe. Yet beneath this bustle there must also have been quieter feelings, especially for the bride and groom themselves. Medieval life did not encourage endless public display of private emotion, but emotion was there all the same. There may have been excitement, embarrassment, relief, fear, hope, and that strange floating unreality that often settles over important days, making them feel both intensely present and slightly unbelievable. The marriage had been discussed, arranged, approved, and prepared, yet the wedding morning was the first time it became impossible to think of it as something still at a distance. The future had now entered the house. That is why the wedding morning matters so much in the story. It is the last stretch of private time before the community takes hold of the event. Once the household begins to move outward, the marriage will belong not only to the couple and their families, but to witnesses, ritual, blessing, and public memory. The morning therefore stands in a delicate place between domestic familiarity and ceremonial exposure, between the shelter of home and the path that leads toward the church. Everything is still ordinary, and nothing feels ordinary at all. However near the church might have been, the journey toward it carried more significance than the distance itself, because once the bride and groom left the household behind and began moving through the public world, the marriage ceased to be only a family matter in preparation and became a visible event already unfolding. In a village, the road might have been short enough to measure by familiar houses, muddy paths, or the turn beside a field that everyone knew by heart. Yet on that day, even the most ordinary route would have felt changed. Roads do not usually become ceremonial, but people do, and once enough eyes are fixed upon them, even a few quiet steps can begin to feel almost historical. The walk to the church mattered partly because it made the couple seen. Medieval marriage was not meant to remain hidden within private feeling or household negotiation. It required public recognition, witness, and communal awareness. Neighbours might watch from doorways, relatives gather along the path, children trail with curiosity, and older villagers observe with the practiced expression of people who had seen many weddings and still believed each one deserved careful attention. For wealthier households, the journey could be slower, richer, and more formally impressive, with attendants, horses, brighter garments, and a greater sense of display. For humbler people, it might be simpler, but no less meaningful. In both cases, the road carried the marriage from intention into visible reality. There's also something quietly vulnerable about this moment, because until now the couple have been mostly surrounded by those who arranged, approved, or prepared the union. On the way to the church, they begin to belong to the gaze of the community at large. Every gesture, garment, and expression may be noticed. The bride's composure, the groom's bearing, the order of those accompanying them, and even the mood of the procession all become part of how the wedding will later be remembered. A path that meant almost nothing yesterday now becomes the bridge between private decision and public acknowledgement. And so the journey to the church was never just practical movement from one place to another. It was part of the wedding's language. It announced that the couple were leaving one state of life and entering another under the eyes of the world around them. By the time they reached the churchyard, they'd already begun crossing a threshold, even before a single vow had been spoken. The road had done its work. The private household was behind them, the gathered community around them, and the church door ahead, waiting like the next sentence in a story everyone knew mattered. One of the details most likely to surprise a modern listener is that an important part of a medieval wedding often began not deep inside the church, but at the church door itself, because marriage in the Middle Ages stood at the meeting point between public life and sacred life. The doorway was therefore an ideal place for the rite to begin. It belonged to the church, yet it also remained visible to the community outside. In that threshold space, the couple could be seen, named, questioned, and ritually joined before passing further inward. The setting itself carried meaning. They were no longer simply two people approaching marriage. They were standing between the ordinary world behind them and the consecrated order into which their union was about to be received. At the door, the priest might begin the formal proceedings, and this was where consent, intention, and legitimacy became especially important. Medieval marriage, for all its family pressure and practical negotiation, still required something fundamental that the church increasingly emphasized: the willing words of the couple themselves. This did not mean every union was free of pressure, nor that all brides and grooms stood there as perfectly equal agents in the modern sense, but it did mean that what was said at this moment mattered profoundly. A marriage was not supposed to be pure household arrangement dressed in holy clothing. It had to become, at least in principle, a union entered through recognizable consent. There was something solemn and almost exposed about this stage of the ceremony. The couple stood publicly, yet not quite fully enclosed by sacred space. They were still in view of family, neighbours, and all the small currents of social observation that had followed them from the road. Every gesture could be noticed. Every hesitation might be remembered. One imagines that some couples stood with graceful composure, while others surely looked like people trying very hard not to think about the fact that everyone was watching them attempt seriousness all at once. Weddings, even when holy, do not entirely lose their human awkwardness, and perhaps that is part of their charm. What matters most is that the church door made the marriage visible as a communal fact before it became fully sanctified within the church. It was a place of declaration, and declaration mattered. Medieval society wanted marriage to be known, witnessed, and spoken into form, rather than hidden in uncertainty. At the threshold, therefore, the wedding announced itself. The families had prepared, the couple had arrived, The witnesses were present, the words were ready, and in that narrow space between outside and inside, one life was about to close, while another began. Once the ceremony had begun at the church door, the wedding moved toward its most serious centre, and that centre was not the feast, not the clothing, and not even the approval of the families, but the exchange of consent. Medieval marriage, especially under the growing influence of church teaching, rested heavily on the idea that a true union required the willing words of the man and woman themselves. This did not erase pressure, inequality, or family influence, yet it did give remarkable importance to spoken agreement. A marriage could involve dowry, kin strategy, and public expectation, but at its heart it still needed a bride and groom who said, in recognizable form, that they accepted one another. That gave the vows extraordinary weight, in a world where spoken promises could carry legal and moral force. These words were not decorative lines in a ritual built on other foundations. They were among the foundations. To consent before witnesses, under sacred authority, was to step from intention into bond. The Church increasingly taught that marriage was not simply arranged around the couple, but enacted through them. And for that reason, the moment of consent stood close to the centre of the rite. Families could guide, priests could bless, and communities could witness, but no one else could speak the marriage fully into being on the couple's behalf. There is something deeply human in that, because it means that however structured and unequal the medieval world may have been, the wedding still narrowed for a moment to two people and two voices. They may have spoken with confidence, trembling relief, or the strange numbness that sometimes accompanies important moments, but once the words were given, the atmosphere changed. The ceremony was no longer leading toward marriage, it had begun to become marriage. One imagines that everyone present could feel that shift, even if no one said so aloud. The air after a vow is never quite the same as the air before it. This is also why the Church treated marriage with such seriousness. It was not merely a social convenience dressed in piety, but a morally significant union meant to carry dignity, permanence, and obligation. Medieval marriages did not always live up to that ideal, and many must have fallen painfully short of the holiness spoken over them. Yet the ideal itself mattered. It raised the wedding above household arrangement and placed it within sacred order. By the time the vows had been spoken and consent made visible, the marriage had crossed another threshold. What remained now was the blessing, the ring, and the symbolic gestures that would help the whole community see what the words had already begun to accomplish. After the vows had been spoken and consent had given the marriage its true centre, the ceremony moved into the world of symbols, and medieval people cared deeply about symbols because symbols made invisible meanings visible. A promise could be heard, certainly, but a ring placed on the hand, a blessing spoken over the couple, or a ritual gesture performed before witnesses gave the marriage shape in a way the whole community could recognise. These things were not empty decorations added for beauty after the serious work was done. They helped translate the union into forms that memory could hold, and medieval society depended heavily on forms that could be seen, repeated, and understood by everyone present. The ring was among the clearest of these signs. It did not always look exactly as later centuries would imagine it, nor did every wedding across Europe use ritual objects in precisely the same way. But where rings were present, they carried both practical and symbolic force. A circle had its own obvious meaning, suggesting continuity, fidelity, and a bond without break, while the very act of placing the ring on the bride's hand made the union visible as something now acknowledged before God and the gathered world. In wealthy circles, the ring might be richer in material and craftsmanship, but its deeper purpose remained the same, even in more modest settings. It was a sign that something binding had been formed, and signs mattered because memory can be unreliable, whereas a ritual act seen by many becomes harder to deny. Blessings added another layer, because the marriage was not meant to remain only a social agreement witnessed by neighbours. It was being drawn under sacred protection and sacred expectation. The priest's words, gestures, and prayers placed the couple inside the church's understanding of what marriage ought to be, which meant the union was now being spoken of not only in human terms, but in moral and spiritual ones as well. This gave the wedding a seriousness beyond household strategy or family relief. The pair were no longer simply approved by their community, they were being blessed within a larger order that claimed to reach beyond the village, beyond the town, and even beyond the present life. There is also something very beautiful in the fact that medieval weddings relied on such visible and tactile things. Hands joined, rings exchanged, blessings spoken aloud, faces turned toward the couple, symbols worked because they made a mystery feel touchable. Marriage remained larger than any single gesture, yet people still needed gestures to understand it. That is why these ritual signs stayed so close to the heart of the ceremony. They allowed everyone present to see, in gold, in prayer, in bodily movement, and in sacred words, that the marriage now existed not merely as hope or intention, but as a real and recognized bond. At this point in the story, it becomes especially useful to pause and look at the wedding from two heights at once, because one of the most revealing truths about medieval marriage is that noble weddings and peasant weddings could feel strikingly different in scale, display, and material richness, while still sharing the same deeper structure beneath the surface. The noble wedding might unfold beneath banners, carved beams, better fabrics, richer food, and the watchful eyes of people who cared as much about inheritance and alliance as they did about the happiness of the couple. The peasant wedding, by contrast, might take place with fewer luxuries, simpler garments, shorter distances, and a table built from modest resources. Yet both worlds still understood marriage as a public, serious, and community-shaped event rather than a private emotional choice, floating free from the rest of life. For the nobility, marriage often carried obvious strategic weight. A wedding could strengthen political ties, secure land, stabilize inheritance, or bind one family to another in ways that reached far beyond the pair standing before the priest. That gave elite weddings an added layer of ceremony and calculation. Clothing was finer, the feast more elaborate, the guests more carefully ranked, and the atmosphere more consciously performative. A noble family was not simply marrying off a child, it was presenting itself, announcing continuity, and making visible claims about status, power, and future security. Even joy, when present, moved inside that framework. One suspects that some noble brides and grooms felt a little like the most beautifully dressed figures in a negotiation. Among peasants, the marriage was less likely to shift the map of politics, but that did not make it less important. A peasant wedding joined labour, resources, kin support, and daily life in ways that could be just as decisive for survival as a noble alliance was for lineage. The feast might be smaller, the clothing less splendid, and the public ritual simpler in outward form, yet the emotional and practical weight could be immense. A village marriage still mattered to family honour, household strength, and communal order. People still watched, they still remembered, they still judged whether the union seemed respectable, viable, and properly entered. If a noble wedding announced power, a peasant wedding more often announced steadiness. But steadiness in the medieval world was a kind of power too. So the difference between noble and peasant weddings should not be understood as the difference between meaningful ceremony and mere local custom. Both were meaningful, both were deeply social, both were shaped by religion, expectation, and the future. The great contrast lay in resources, visibility, and the degree to which marriage served wider strategy beyond the household itself. A peasant wedding might be warmer in its simplicity, while a noble one might be grander in its display. But beneath both lay the same essential truth. Marriage was one of the chief ways medieval society reproduced itself. It did so in manor halls and village lanes alike, each according to its means, but never without consequence. Once the vows had been spoken, the ring exchanged, and the marriage publicly recognized, the center of the day began to shift from sacred solemnity towards social celebration, and this is where the wedding feast entered with all its warmth, importance, and carefully observed meaning. A medieval wedding meal was never just food placed before hungry people who had been standing too long in church, though no doubt some guests were already thinking about bread with admirable spiritual intensity. The feast mattered because it marked the union in visible communal form. It allowed the marriage to be received by family, neighbours, guests, and household members through hospitality, abundance, and shared presence at the table. In that sense, the feast was not an afterthought. It was one of the main ways the wedding became real in ordinary life. The form of the feast depended greatly on class and means, but in every setting it carried symbolic weight. In a peasant household, the meal might be modest but carefully prepared, with bread, ale, pottage, meat if fortune allowed, and the best the family could gather without endangering the weeks that followed. In a noble setting, the scale widened dramatically. More dishes appeared, seating became more formal, service more structured, and the entire event moved closer to display as well as generosity. Yet whether simple or grand, the wedding meal always said something about the household offering it. A family that fed guests well, showed honour, competence, and seriousness about the marriage. A table poorly arranged or meanly supplied risked suggesting weakness, embarrassment, or disorder, none of which medieval people were eager to advertise if they could help it. Seating itself could carry meaning. Who sat near the couple, who sat near the parents, who received better service, and who occupied more modest places, all reflected the social world surrounding the marriage. Medieval meals were rarely careless about rank, and wedding feasts were no exception. Even in a warm and joyful gathering, hierarchy still had a seat at the table, and usually knew exactly where to place itself. That did not make the event cold, it simply meant that celebration unfolded within a society deeply accustomed to reading, position, precedence, and visible order. A feast was meant to gather people together, but not to pretend that everyone stood in the same place. There is something especially appealing about this moment in the story, because it is where tension begins to loosen, though not entirely disappear. The ceremony is over. The formal threshold has been crossed. People begin to eat, speak more freely, observe one another with less severity, and settle into the rhythm of a shared meal. Relief enters the room, and with it a different kind of memory begins to form. The wedding is no longer only a sacred event witnessed in solemnity. It is becoming a lived celebration, one in which tables, cups, benches, and serving platters helped the marriage take its place in the social body of the community. Once the wedding feast had settled into motion and the first intensity of ceremony began to soften, another part of the day could emerge more fully, and that was the world of music, dancing, games, and festive entertainment. A medieval wedding was not meant to remain solemn from beginning to end, as though everyone had gathered merely to observe a legal and sacred transaction in respectful silence before going home to think serious thoughts. Joy had its place, and that place was often loud enough, lively enough, and public enough to remind everyone present that a marriage was not only a binding union, but also a communal occasion worthy of sound, movement, laughter, and memory. Even societies deeply concerned with order still understood the importance of celebration, perhaps because order itself becomes easier to bear when it occasionally learns how to dance. The exact form of entertainment depended, as so much did, on class, place, and means. In a village setting, music might come from local players with pipes, fiddles, drums, or voices, while dancing could be communal, repetitive, and deeply tied to familiar patterns of movement that everyone recognized, even if not everyone performed them gracefully. In a noble household, the entertainment might be more elaborate, with professional musicians, formal dancing, recitations, or diversions suited to the scale of the gathering. Yet in both settings, the effect was similar. The wedding moved from ceremony into shared emotion. Bodies that had stood carefully at the church door or sat with proper restraint at table were now allowed to loosen, move, and express delight in more visible ways. This does not mean medieval wedding merriment was pure chaos, though one suspects a few guests in every century have tried bravely to prove otherwise. Festive entertainment still took place inside a social world that valued rank, propriety, and memory. People knew who could dance boldly, who should remain dignified, who would sing too loudly after too much ale, and which relative would eventually begin telling a story that improved itself with every retelling. The charm of such moments lies partly in their familiarity. Medieval weddings, for all their distance from us, still seem to have known that once music begins, human beings become slightly more honest versions of themselves. What matters most is that this part of the celebration allowed the marriage to be felt not only as a duty fulfilled, but as a happiness shared. Music and dancing made the event breathe differently. They changed the room from a place of witness into a place of participation. The couple were no longer only being observed, they were being welcomed into married life through communal joy. In that sense, festive entertainment did more than amuse. It helped the wedding become emotionally complete, giving movement, rhythm, and laughter to a day that had already carried so much solemn meaning. At a medieval wedding feast, food and drink did far more than satisfy hunger, because once the meal became part of a marriage celebration, it also became part of the language through which a household presented itself to the world. Bread, meat, ale, wine, fish, pies, pottage, sweet dishes, and whatever else appeared on the board were not only nourishment, they were signs of effort, generosity, status, and capability. A family that could feed guests well showed that the marriage was being honoured properly, and in medieval society, proper honour mattered a great deal. Even in modest settings, the attempt to make the table feel fuller, warmer, or more festive than usual carried meaning. The wedding meal was not expected to look like ordinary supper. It was supposed to announce that this day stood above the rest. That is why abundance, or at least the appearance of it, mattered so much. In wealthy households, food and drink could become openly theatrical. Multiple courses, carved meats, fine breads, richer wines, and a more carefully ordered service all helped turn the feast into a visible statement of power and refinement. In humbler homes, the scale was smaller, but the instinct was often the same. Bread might be better than usual, ale more generously poured, meat more present than on ordinary days, and the table arranged with special care. A wedding had to feel like an occasion, and food was one of the clearest ways to create that feeling. Medieval people understood instinctively that what is placed before guests says something about what the hosts think the marriage deserves. Drink intensified this social meaning. Ale, wine, and other festive drinking did not simply accompany the meal. They helped shape its emotional tone. Cups raised the warmth of the gathering, loosened conversation, and marked hospitality in visible form. Yet even here, the feast remained socially legible. Better drink, more refined service, and freer pouring often reflected rank as clearly as clothing or seating. The wedding table, therefore, continued to display hierarchy even while appearing generous to all. Celebration did not erase status. It dressed status in hospitality and invited people to enjoy it. This is what makes wedding food so revealing. It sat at the point where joy, obligation, pride, and performance all met one another. A feast could nourish, impress, reassure, and bind the community more closely to the event all at once. Behind every platter and cup stood a household making a public statement, whether grand or modest, about how it wished the marriage to be seen. And because weddings never belonged only to the couple themselves, the table also became a place where guests responded, judged, praised, remembered, and quietly measured what kind of life they believed the new union was stepping into. After the vows, the feast, and the first warmth of celebration had begun to settle across the day, another layer of the wedding became more visible, and that was the way the community itself responded to the marriage through gifts, blessings, and expectation. A medieval wedding was never only an event witnessed from a distance. It invited participation. Relatives, neighbours, household allies, and guests did not merely come to observe that a union had taken place. They came to acknowledge it, support it, and in some sense claim a place within its beginning. This is where gifts and good wishes mattered, not only as signs of kindness, but as proof that the marriage was entering an already existing network of obligation, memory, and shared life. The gifts themselves varied greatly according to class and means. In wealthy circles, they might include fine textiles, vessels, coin, jewellery, animals, land-related value, or symbolic objects worthy of display. In humbler settings, gifts could be simpler but no less meaningful. Bread, linens, tools, household goods, food, cups, bedding, or small practical items that would help sustain the new home. What mattered was not luxury alone, but usefulness joined to goodwill. A wedding gift in the medieval world was rarely just decorative. It often carried the quiet message that marriage is not built on feeling only, but on the daily life that follows it. And someone who gives a chest or blanket is, in effect, offering a blessing in wooden or woven form. Blessings, too, belonged to more than the priest. Families blessed the union through approval, elders through words of guidance, neighbours through presents, and the whole gathering through recognition. Medieval communities often understood marriage as a morals and social foundation, which meant they did not leave it entirely to the couple once the formal rite had ended. A new union came with hopes attached to it. People expected steadiness, fertility, respectability, labour, and some recognisable effort toward household order. They wished the couple well, but they also expected them to become the sort of married people upon whom society depended. A medieval blessing was therefore both generous and demanding. It gave support, but it also quietly reminded the couple that they were entering a role larger than themselves. That is what gives this stage of the wedding such depth. Gifts, kind words, gestures of goodwill, and shared celebration could feel warm and communal. Yet beneath them stood a serious truth. The marriage now belonged to a wider social world that intended to remember it, interpret it, and measure it over time. The couple were not simply beginning private life together. They were being woven into a pattern the community already recognized. In that sense, a blessing was never only about happiness. It was also about continuity. The wedding was creating not just a pair, but a new household the world around it hoped would hold. By the time a medieval wedding had reached the stage of feasting, gifts, and public approval, it had already become clear that marriage was surrounded not only by law, religion, and family interest, but also by a whole world of custom, symbol, and inherited belief that could make the day feel at once sacred, practical, and just slightly mysterious. This is where medieval weddings become especially fascinating to modern eyes, because many of the gestures that once felt natural to those present now seem unusual, charming, or a little strange. Yet these customs were rarely meaningless. They were tied to hopes for fertility, good fortune, harmony, prosperity, protection from misfortune, and the smooth beginning of a new household. A wedding, after all, was not merely a joyful event, it was a risky transition, and human beings have always been inventive when trying to make risky transitions feel safer. Some customs were religious in tone, others more local and folkloric, and many lived somewhere between the two. Blessings might mix easily with older beliefs about luck, timing, or symbolic objects. A household could take the church seriously while still caring very much whether the weather seemed favourable, whether certain foods were present, whether a garment or token carried good meaning, or whether the day felt properly fortunate. Medieval people did not always divide the sacred and the superstitious as neatly as later minds might prefer. They lived in a world full of signs, and weddings naturally gathered signs around themselves because everyone wanted the new marriage to begin under the best possible conditions. This meant that symbolic gestures could appear almost anywhere. Food itself might represent abundance, candles might suggest divine blessing or ordered hope, veils could imply modesty, transition, or protection. Hands joined publicly became more than a practical gesture. They became a visible image of unity. Gifts of bread, cloth or household goods could carry meanings beyond their immediate use, speaking of prosperity, continuity, or domestic well-being. Even moments that now seem quaint may once have carried real emotional force. A custom survives not because it is ridiculous, but because enough people once felt that it mattered. There is something deeply human in this. Medieval weddings remind us that people have always wanted marriage to begin with more than legal correctness alone. They have wanted it to begin beautifully, safely, auspiciously, and with some sense that the unseen world is not entirely hostile. That desire produces ritual, and ritual often produces gestures that later generations find curious. Yet beneath every strange custom lies a familiar hope. May this union last. May this house prosper. May these two people be spared needless sorrow, and may the future arrive more gently than life sometimes does. Among the customs that make medieval weddings feel most unfamiliar to modern people, few are more striking than the bedding ritual, because it sits directly on the uneasy line between what was considered private and what was still understood as partly public. To a modern mind, marriage usually reaches its most intimate point by withdrawing from the community, But medieval society did not always draw that boundary in the same place. In some settings, especially among the wealthy, but not only there, the transition from feast to bed could itself become ritualized, observed, and symbolically shared by others. This did not mean that every wedding ended in theatrical intrusion, or that privacy did not exist at all. But it does mean that medieval people often treated the beginning of married life as something too socially significant to disappear immediately behind a closed door without acknowledgement. The bedding ritual could take different forms depending on place, class, and custom. But in general, it involved escorting the bride and groom toward the marriage bed with a mixture of ceremony, blessing, joking, and public witness. Friends, relatives, or attendants might accompany them, offer good wishes, remove outer garments, or see them to the threshold of the chamber before withdrawing. In noble contexts, this could become quite formal, because the marriage was not merely personal, but dynastic, and the beginning of married life carried symbolic importance. In more ordinary settings, the mood may have been simpler, rougher, or touched with village humour, yet the deeper meaning remained. The marriage was being ushered from public vow into domestic reality, and the community wanted to mark that passage. What makes this ritual so revealing is that it shows how differently medieval society understood intimacy. Marriage did not instantly create an invisible private world sealed off from family and community. Instead, the first steps into privacy were often framed by public recognition. This could be tender, awkward, embarrassing, solemn, or faintly comic, depending on the people involved. And one suspects that many brides and grooms discovered at this point that medieval society had a very enthusiastic relationship with symbolic participation. Yet the goal was not simply intrusion for its own sake. It was to acknowledge that the union had moved from promise and blessing into embodied married life, and that this transition, however delicate, mattered enough to deserve ritual. That is why the bedding ceremony should be treated carefully, not as a crude curiosity, but as part of the larger medieval habit of surrounding important transitions with visible forms. Birth, death, betrothal, feast, vow, and marriage all attracted ritual, because ritual helped the community recognize what was changing. The bedding rite may feel strange to us because it touches the edge of privacy, but in medieval terms it belonged to the same symbolic world as the church door, the ring, and the feast. It marked a threshold, and medieval people were deeply attentive to thresholds. Here, as elsewhere, marriage was not left to unfold unnoticed. It was guided, blessed, and carried across each stage with the full, sometimes over-helpful attention of the world around it. If the bedding ritual marked the edge between public ceremony and private union, then the first night itself carried a meaning that was far larger than romance alone, because medieval society did not view the wedding night simply as a tender ending to a long day. It was often understood as the moment when marriage passed more fully from spoken promise into lived reality. This did not mean that every marriage was judged instantly or that every household treated the night in exactly the same way, yet the first night could still carry legal, familial, and social weight. People cared about what it represented because medieval marriage was not only a blessing exchanged before witnesses, it was also a union expected to become fruitful, stable, and complete in the ordinary world of bodies, households, and future children. That gave the first night a seriousness modern stories sometimes smooth away. For noble families especially, the consummation of a marriage could matter in dynastic terms, since inheritance, legitimacy, and alliance all rested ultimately on whether the union became fully embodied and potentially reproductive. In humbler households, the same logic existed in a less grand but no less real form. Marriage was expected to begin a shared domestic life that included sexual union, childbearing if possible, and the practical continuation of the household. The first night, therefore, stood at the point where public vows met private expectation, and that meeting could be emotionally heavy even when no one said so aloud. At the same time, reality must often have been far less tidy than ideal custom suggested. Weddings were exhausting. People were watched all day, fed heavily, blessed, advised, celebrated, and escorted from one symbolic stage to another. And by evening they were expected to behave as though none of this might produce a little nervousness, awkwardness, or sheer fatigue. History is full of magnificent ceremonies, but human beings remain inconveniently human within them. One suspects that some medieval couples faced the first night with tenderness, some with hesitation, some with confusion, and some with a strong desire to sleep first and become symbolic again tomorrow. That, perhaps, is what makes the first night so interesting in a serious historical sense. It sits between ideal and reality. Society loaded it with expectation, yet real people still had to inhabit it with all their ordinary uncertainty. Medieval culture treated it as important because marriage was not thought complete in purely abstract terms. It was expected to become physical, domestic, and future-bearing. But like so many things in married life, the official meaning and the lived experience were not always identical. The first night mattered, certainly, though perhaps not always in the neat and ceremonial way later imagination prefers. By the morning after the wedding, the great public brightness of the day before had already begun to change into something quieter and more telling. Because once the vows, feast, music, and ritual had passed, the marriage entered the first ordinary morning of its life. That change mattered. A wedding could be ceremonial, crowded and richly symbolic, but the morning after was often the moment when the union began to feel less like an event and more like a condition. The bride and groom woke, not as two people moving toward marriage, but as a married pair already placed within new expectations. In medieval life, that shift could be felt almost immediately, especially by the bride, whose social position might now look subtly but unmistakably different to everyone around her. The household atmosphere on such a morning was probably unlike the day before. The noise had softened. The crowd, even if not yet gone, no longer gathered in the same ceremonial mood. Food might still be present, relatives still nearby, and comments still offered with the confidence of people who have no intention of leaving a life-changing event uninterpreted. Yet the centre of gravity had shifted. The wedding was no longer about anticipation, it was about recognition. A marriage now existed, and the couple were expected to begin inhabiting it with dignity. There may have been tenderness in that morning, or embarrassment, or relief, or simply fatigue disguised as solemnity, which is a condition wedding history has likely seen more than once. For the bride especially, the morning after could carry the feeling of entering a new social identity. Depending on class and living arrangements, she might now be attached more fully to another household, another authority structure, another routine, and another set of expectations. Even when the move was small in distance, the symbolic change could still be large. A woman might remain near the same fields, church or village paths, yet be read differently because she was now married. The same woman, the same face, the same hands, and yet the community would see a new status settled over her like an added garment. The groom, too, entered a more formal version of himself, now expected to act not merely as son or bachelor, but as husband, provider, and household man. That is why the morning after deserves attention. It reveals the wedding not as a self-contained spectacle, but as the doorway into a new daily life. The garlands fade, the music quiets, the jokes lose some of their force, and the real work of marriage waits in ordinary light. Medieval society understood this well. The wedding mattered, yes, but the life that followed it mattered more. And so the morning after stands as the first calm page after a richly decorated opening, a moment when symbol begins to harden into habit, and when marriage, having been blessed and witnessed, begins its long work of being lived. By the time the wedding day had passed and the first ordinary mornings of marriage had begun, medieval life returned to its deeper truth, which is that a marriage was never judged only by the beauty of its ceremony, but by whether it could endure the long, uneven pressure of ordinary years. A good wedding might be remembered fondly, but memory alone could not carry a household through poor harvests, illness, childbirth, debt, quarrels, unequal temperaments, or the slow fatigue of work repeated across seasons. This is where the real story of medieval marriage begins to emerge more clearly, because once the feast ended, the union had to prove whether it could become not merely lawful, but livable. When marriage went well, it seems to have done so through a mixture of affection, habit, mutual usefulness, and shared endurance, rather than through constant romance in the modern sense. A good husband was not expected to be a poet, and a good wife was not expected to float gracefully through candlelight without ever needing to scrub, count, mend, carry, or worry. A workable marriage often meant that each person understood the burdens of the other well enough to prevent daily life from becoming a battlefield of resentment. Respect may have mattered as much as tenderness, and steadiness as much as passion. In such unions, warmth could grow, not because life was easy, but because both people learned how to bear its weight together. Yet medieval marriage could also go badly, and there is no reason to soften that truth. A wedding blessed by the church and applauded by the community was no guarantee of peace, kindness, or happiness. Mismatched temperaments, family conflict, economic strain, infertility, cruelty, absence, disappointment, or simple incompatibility could darken married life just as surely then as now. In a society where roles were unequal and escape from marriage was difficult, such hardship could be especially heavy. The ideals surrounding marriage were strong, but ideals do not cook meals, resolve resentment, or make two difficult people easier to live with. Medieval life, for all its ritual dignity, still had to be lived by ordinary humans, and ordinary humans remained stubbornly complicated in every century. That is what makes this part of the story so important. It reminds us that a medieval wedding was not the end of the tale, but the formal beginning of a long experiment in shared life. Some couples likely found comfort, loyalty, companionship, and even quiet happiness. Others endured rather than flourished. Some perhaps moved between both states over time. Marriage in the medieval world could be a shelter, a discipline, a burden, a partnership, a duty, and sometimes a tenderness that grew slowly enough to surprise the people inside it. The wedding gave the union shape, but the years that followed gave it truth. When we step back from the church door, the ring, the feast table, the garments, the music, the family negotiations, the strange customs, and the many small tensions that gathered around the day, what begins to appear is something larger than a wedding in the narrow sense. A medieval wedding was not simply a romantic occasion, nor merely a legal arrangement, nor only a religious rite, though it contained all of those things at once. It was one of the clearest places where medieval society revealed how it understood life itself. Through marriage, people tried to join love to duty, family to future, property to continuity, and private feeling to public order. A wedding mattered because it brought all these worlds into one visible moment. That is why the medieval wedding feels so rich when told slowly. It allows us to see that the Middle Ages were not built only out of castles, laws, and battles, but also out of households trying to remain stable, communities trying to remain coherent, and human beings trying to find tenderness inside structures much larger than themselves. A marriage could be hopeful, strategic, unequal, sacred, practical, festive, and frightening all at once. It could contain genuine affection while still being shaped by family pressure. It could feel blessed and burdened in the same hour. Medieval people understood this complexity without always explaining it. They lived inside it. The wedding was one of the places where that complexity became ceremonial enough for everyone to see. What makes the subject so enduring is that it feels distant and familiar at the same time. The clothing, ritual forms, church customs, and public expectations may belong to another age, yet beneath them we still recognize nerves, hope, awkwardness, pride, fear, and the deep human wish that a life begun in public might become gentle in private. We recognize relatives giving too much advice, households worrying over appearances, and couples stepping into a future that no ceremony, however beautiful, can fully explain in advance. The centuries change, but not every emotion changes with them. A medieval wedding may look strange to us in form, yet in feeling it is often unexpectedly close. And so the truest meaning of a medieval wedding lies not in any single object or ritual, but in the fact that it stood at the meeting point of nearly everything that mattered in medieval life. It joined faith to law, family to property, household to community, body to symbol, and individual feeling to social expectation. It was a threshold in the deepest sense, a crossing from one form of life into another, witnessed by the world and blessed by the church, yet still carried at last by two imperfect people who had to live it day by day. That is what a medieval wedding truly meant. Not just the promise of love, and not just the weight of duty, but the moment when an entire society gathered around a union and said in its own careful way, "This is how life continues." If you stayed with me until the end, I hope this journey through the world of medieval weddings gave you a quieter, richer picture of the past. Not just the ceremony, but the lives, pressures, hopes and customs that surrounded it. And for now, let the bells fade, let the feast grow distant, and let the old church doors close softly behind us. Good night.